It is Wednesday, August the 23rd, 2017. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore we will pass over some of them quickly but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing or you'll not be able to see some of the detail we will be discussing in the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's macro online updates. The research document this month updates U.S. economic developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of our monthly report: the global risk, macro, and regional economic developments. As I so often do, I'd like to tie them together into a continuation of a discussion we had last month on how financialization in America came about and where it will lead us. This month I'd like to share with you a presentation that my colleague Richard Duncan put together, which discusses the same topic which I did last month, but I think from a different perspective. I thought you would find it very complimentary and be well served to hear it in achieving a full view of the subject. I encourage you very much to subscribe to Richard's Macro Watch service. Richard Duncan, as part of his Macro Watch service, is in the process of laying out where financialization will lead us. As you might expect, it is different than my view, but again, you would be well served to compare the two views. Let's listen today to what Richard has to say on the subject.
Okay, today there's a great deal of confusion about what's gone wrong with the global economy. Economic textbooks no longer seem able to explain real-world economic developments. Many people blame the crisis on financial sector deregulation beginning in the 1970s, or on free trade policies beginning in the 1980s, or on policy mistakes by the Fed during the 1990s. However, the truth is that the origins of this crisis go back much further than any of those explanations suggest. To understand how this crisis began, we need to look back to World War I. That's when the classical gold standard first broke down, and things have never been the same since then. In 1914, when all the European nations went to war, they didn't have enough gold to pay for the war. So their governments began issuing enormous amounts of government debt, and their central banks began printing money on a truly extraordinary scale to finance that debt. So that was the end of the classical gold standard. Money was no longer backed by gold. All the government debt and all the paper money issued during the war led to a worldwide credit bubble a few years later. Now we call that credit bubble the Roaring Twenties. Okay, in this chart, what we have is U.S. government outlays. In other words, U.S. government spending from 1900 up to 1929. You can see when the war started in 1914, but the United States didn't join the war, didn't enter the war until 1917. But once it did, total government spending increased from less than $1 billion in 1916, jumping up to $18 billion by 1919. And because the United States didn't enter the war until 1917, up until that time, it sold war materials to all the warring nations in Europe, and it insisted on being paid with gold. So during the first years of the war, U.S. gold reserves more than doubled. And that new inflow of gold into the United States fueled a consumer credit boom. Because under the gold standard, gold acted as the base upon which credit could be extended. The more gold a country had, the more credit could be created. So this inflow of gold during the war years into the United States, this sparked off the consumer credit boom during the 1920s that led to the Roaring Twenties. So a credit boom caused the Roaring Twenties, But in 1930, all of that credit couldn't be repaid. At that point, the boom turned to bust. The international banking system collapsed, international trade broke down, and the world spiraled into the Great Depression. The Depression lasted until World War II started. Then, US government spending on the war created an astonishing economic boom that lasted for decades. In this chart, you can see US government outlays from 1920 up until 1949. In 1940, total US government spending was $10 billion. By 1943, it had jumped to 80 billion and then to 90 billion. Now notice what happened during the Depression years from 1930. Yes, okay, US government spending picked up some in a few of these years, but then fell back again in 1937 and 38. The economy went back into recession. But it was only this truly extraordinary surge in government spending that brought the Great Depression to an end. Government spending increased by 900% between 1940 and 1943. And the US government took over all aspects of the economy: production, distribution, prices, wages, even labor. And the war completely transformed the structure of the US economy. It never returned to normal. The government has been managing the economy ever since. Okay, in this chart, you can see that by the time the war ended in 1945, US government debt had increased to 113% of GDP, up from practically nothing in 1916. Now, this chart shows US government outlays as a percent of GDP going back to 1930 and up to the present. Notice 1930, the US government was only spending about 4% of GDP. During the Depression, that increased to as much as 11%. But keep in mind, during those years, the GDP collapsed by about 50%. So it wasn't so much that government spending increased as that the GDP collapsed. But then, when the war started, government spending did explode to 43% of GDP. When the war ended, government cut back on its spending. But then the Korean War started, and the Cold War started. And since this time, since the end of the war, government spending has averaged roughly 21% of GDP every year since the end of World War II. In fact, the government was terrified that the economy was going to go back into a Great Depression once the war ended. So the government kept spending to make sure that didn't happen. Now look at this chart from 1940 up to the present. Remember that huge surge in government spending that we saw during World War II? Well, here it is. And look what happened afterwards. Government spending has increased at a mind-boggling pace to enormous sums today. Now, when the war ended, US government debt started coming down as a percentage of GDP. But consumer debt, household sector debt, moved higher. And the increase in government and household debt fueled the economy and allowed the government debt to come down. After the war ended, it wasn't possible to go back onto a gold standard because most countries didn't have any gold left. So the United States and its allies put in place a new international monetary system that was designed to replicate the gold standard. Under this new Bretton Woods system, US dollars were backed by gold and other currencies were pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. During the late 1950s and throughout the 60s, a lot of dollars flowed out of the United States and into other countries. That happened in part because U.S. corporations and banks invested heavily in Europe. In part, it was due to spending on the Vietnam War, and in part because the U.S. economy became overheated as a result of government spending on social welfare programs. And under the Bretton Woods system, other countries had the right to convert the dollars they obtained into U.S. gold. So as you can see in this chart, during the 1960s, the U.S. lost half of its gold reserves. And by the end of the decade, it no longer had enough gold to continue backing dollars with gold. So between 1968 and 1971, the United States stopped backing dollars with gold, and that destroyed the Bretton Woods international monetary system. It also removed nearly all the constraints on how much credit could be created. You can see that up until 1968, what this chart shows is currency outside of banks. In other words, all the dollars in circulation. Here we have up until 1968. At this point, all the dollars were backed by gold. The Fed had to maintain at least 25% gold backing for every dollar that it issued. But in 1968, President Johnson asked Congress to remove that requirement, and they did. And you can see how much paper money has been issued since then. And it removed the constraints on how much credit could be created. So as you can see in this chart, credit absolutely exploded afterwards. Total credit, and by total credit, what I mean is all the debt. Total credit and total debt are the same amount, two sides of the same coin. So total debt first went through $1 trillion in 1964, and it's now expanded 66 times in just 53 years. Now total debt outstanding is $66 trillion. So from $1 trillion of debt to $66 trillion of debt in just 53 years. The red line shows the total amount of debt going back to 1951, and the blue line shows the size of the U.S. economy. You can see how much more rapidly debt has expanded than the economy has. And you can see that again in this chart. This shows the ratio of total credit or total debt to GDP going back to 1951. Up until around 1980, this ratio was roughly 150% of GDP, but then the credit started growing much more rapidly than the economy. And now the ratio is more than 350%. So it's moved up from 150% to 350% just since 1980. So as credit expanded, people had more money to spend, they spent more, and this made the economy grow. So credit growth has been driving economic growth in the United States for decades. Take this chart, for instance. It shows the annual change, in other words, the annual increase in U.S. household debt from 1991 to 2012. Now, notice that from 2003 up until 2007, these are quarterly data points, but U.S. household sector debt increased by an average of $1 trillion a year for 5 years in a row. So this was an increase in debt each year. Households increased their debt by $1 trillion every year for 5 years in a row. But in 2008, they were so heavily indebted, they started to default and couldn't have access to any more credit. And at that point, the crisis started. This chart shows the U.S. current account balance. In other words, it reflects the U.S. trade deficit. Now notice, as long as we were on the Bretton Woods system, trade was roughly in balance. That was true because if the U.S. had a deficit, it would have had to pay with its gold, and it would have quickly run out of gold if it had large deficits. But once we stopped backing dollars with gold, there was no longer any limit on how much the United States could buy from other countries, and this trade deficit became extraordinarily large. peaking at $800 billion in 2006 in that 1 year alone. So the increasing consumer debt in the US resulted in a surge in imports, and the US current account deficit became massive, and it became the driver of global economic growth. The cumulative US current account deficit amounted to $7 trillion between 1980 and 2008. That debt-financed demand from the United States created a global economic boom. Literally hundreds of millions of people were pulled out of poverty. But in 2008, the American households began defaulting on their debt, the current account corrected, and the global bubble began to implode. All right, so in this chart, I compare the Great Depression with our New Depression, as I call it. They had very similar origins, and they played out in very similar ways up until the time of the policy response. So the Great Depression began in 1914. It originated when all the European countries went off the gold standard. After that, there was a global credit boom, the Roaring '20s, but the boom turned to bust when that credit couldn't be repaid, and the banking system collapsed, and international trade collapsed. And at that point, the global policymakers, they believed in laissez-faire and market forces. They didn't know what else to do, and the global economy imploded into a depression. And that depression lasted throughout the 1930s. And during that decade, Europe was taken over by Nazi Germany. Japan was taken over by, Asia was taken over by a militaristic Japan. And then World War II started. And in that war, 60 million people died. Now, this time the pattern has been very similar up until the policy response. In 1971, Nixon stopped allowing other countries to convert their dollars into gold, and the Bretton Woods system broke down. Then a global credit bubble formed on the back of enormous amounts of government debt and increasing amounts of paper money creation. That boom turned into a bust in 2008 when the credit couldn't be repaid. And at that point, the international banking system started to collapse and international trade started to collapse. But this time, instead of letting market forces work and allowing a new market-determined equilibrium to form, global policymakers did everything in their power to prevent that from happening. They reflated this global economic bubble with unprecedented fiscal stimulus and massive unorthodox monetary stimulus. Here you can see the US government's budget deficit from 1960 up until 2016. During the Great Depression, the government had actually tried to balance its budget by reducing spending at a time when tax revenues were collapsing. But this time, the government didn't make that mistake. This time, beginning in 2009, the US government started running budget deficits that exceeded $1 trillion a year for 4 years in a row. And last year, the budget deficit was still roughly $500 billion. The central bank cut interest rates to zero between 2009 and 2016. And the Fed, in late 2008, began creating money on an extraordinary scale. You can see in this chart the Fed's total assets. The Fed printed $3.5 trillion from thin air and used that money to buy financial assets, injecting liquidity into the financial markets. And as it did in 3 rounds of quantitative easing, every time the Fed started printing money and buying assets, the stock market moved higher. And consequently, as interest rates fell and stock prices moved higher, household net worth spiked. You can see this was the low point in 2009. Since then, household net worth, in other words, the assets minus the liabilities of US households, jumped by $35 trillion, by 60% from 2009 to the present. Household net worth is now $90 trillion, far above where it was even in 2007 before the crisis started. And this surge in wealth, well, it created a wealth effect that boosted consumption, and that boosted economic growth in the United States and around the world. So this combination of extraordinarily aggressive fiscal and monetary policy prevented the world from collapsing into a new Great Depression after 2008. This policy worked because it stopped the contraction in credit, and then it made credit expand. In our age, credit growth drives economic growth. This is perhaps the most important thing you need to understand about economics in the 21st century. Credit growth drives economic growth. So our economic system changed during the course of the 20th century. Capitalism evolved into what I call creditism. Under capitalism, the economic growth dynamic was driven by investment and savings. Businessmen would invest, some of them would make a profit, they would save that profit, or in other words, accumulate capital, hence capitalism, and repeat, investment, savings, investment, savings. It was slow and difficult, but that's how capitalism worked. But now our system is different. Now our system is driven by credit creation and consumption. More and more credit is created, and that fuels more and more consumption. Creditism created unprecedented prosperity around the world, but it's now on the verge of collapse because the private sector can't bear any more debt. All right, so to recap, the two world wars destroyed the old economic system of laissez-faire capitalism and the gold standard on which it had been based. It was total war. There was no alternative. During World War II, the US government took over complete control of the US economy. And it worked. Our side won. After the war ended, the government continued managing the economy to prevent it from collapsing back into another Great Depression. For the next several decades, the government kept spending. It spent in part to improve social welfare and in part to defeat the Soviet Union. And it was successful on both fronts. The government also encouraged the growth of private sector debt to drive economic growth. But those policies were unsustainable, and they failed when the private sector couldn't afford to take on any more debt. That's when the crisis of 2008 began. At that point, the government took drastic emergency measures to prevent another complete economic collapse. And so far, those policies have worked. The crisis began 8.5 years ago. There's been no new Great Depression. Not yet, anyway. So how long can this go on? In large part, the answer to that question depends on government policy. The global economy could break down into a new Great Depression in the space of the next few months if the wrong policies are pursued. But on the other hand, with the right policies, the collapse could be put off for decades or avoided altogether. It's impossible to say in advance what the government policy will be. I'll have more to say about that later. But first, let's consider what could go wrong. During the next part of this presentation, I'm going to discuss what I consider to be the 4 greatest threats to the global economy. The first threat is that our credit-dependent economic system seems to be reaching the end of its sustainability.